So thank you all again for joining us tonight. I'm Kate Rosa, a Senior Climate Resilience Project Manager with the City of Boston Office of Climate Resilience. I am leading our U.S. Army Corps Boston Coastal Storm Risk Management Study on behalf of the city. And tonight I'm very excited to walk you all through just some quick goals for today, but you will be hearing from our U.S. Army Corps team primarily tonight, and we have some great speakers today as part of our team, our Corps project delivery team. So tonight, some learning goals for you all we definitely want you to be introduced to what the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, is, and how the U.S. Army Corps is looking at the different ways that the projects can be affected or affect the environment and our other human daily impacts. So socioeconomic, our cultural and historic considerations. They're going to share a lot more information about how you can participate in the NEPA process. And then we will have some time at the end tonight to answer questions. So I will be keeping an eye on the chat and I will be posting links as they are relevant to tonight's presentation. But when it comes to questions, if you want to jot them down in the chat, feel free. But for the most part, I will then collect all of those and we can answer those at the end. So I will go ahead and ask folks to stay on mute while we're going through the presentation, but you will have an opportunity, if you like, to come off of mute when we get to the question and answer portion of tonight's presentation. So with that, I want to turn it over to, oh, we didn't do introductions for the rest of the core team, but I don't want to get too far down the road before we do that. So why don't I pause? I'm going to pass to Jeff just to make sure I can introduce the Army Corps team. So kick it off for us.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Kate. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to join us tonight. On behalf of the Assistant Secretary of the Army for Civil Works, the Honorable Adam Tell, as well as the Chief of Engineers, Lieutenant General William Graham, the NAD Commander, North Atlantic Division Commander, Colonel Jesse Curry, as well as my commander for the New England District out of Concord Park, Massachusetts, Colonel Justin Pavis. Thank you for taking your time tonight. My name is Jeffrey Herzog. I'm the lead planner and program manager for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, New England District's City of Boston CSRM feasibility study. And tonight I have our NEPA specialist as well as our cultural resources specialist. So Todd, I'd ask you to introduce yourself.
Hi, everyone. My name is Todd Randall. I'm a marine ecologist at the New England District, and I've been on this project delivery team, involved in the environmental aspects of it. And so this is what we're going to talk a little bit about today. And then also with us today is Ryan Constantine. I'll let you introduce yourself, Ryan. Thanks.
Evening, everyone. I'm Ryan Constantine. I am an archaeologist and historic preservation subject matter expert with the New York District, and I am assisting the New England District on understanding the cultural heritage and historic preservation concerns of this study. So excited to walk everyone through what we've been working on. So I'll pass it back over to you, Kate.
Thank you. I'm just going to go through a quick refresher and then pass it back over to the core team to kind of lead tonight's presentation. And then you'll see my little floating head, if you have that on your display, go away, and I'll make sure that you can see the faces of our presenters for the rest of the presentation too. So a little quick refresher just to help us get familiar with the planning study. If you have not been able to join us yet at a live recording, a live Zoom presentation, or an in-person meeting, welcome. But I just want to give you a little quick overview of this study. We do have a lot of information available on our webpage, and I will put that link in the chat. But just to give you the quick overview, in the City of Boston, our the Office of Climate Resilience is looking at coastal flooding impacts in 3 different buckets. And we're addressing all three of these buckets concurrently. So we have today's storms, which is how are we managing, strengthening our emergency response to storms of today, and working with our Office of Emergency Management to help educate residents and improve our protocols and preparedness across our communities. In the second bucket, we have preparation for this decade's storms, which is how are we addressing those first up near-term coastal flood pathways. And we're doing this by integrating coastal resilience into ongoing capital upgrade projects or projects that have been in the queue that are going to be constructed and doing what we can to ensure that coastal flood protection can be added to those projects as quickly as possible. So if you're curious to learn more about what some of those near-term or this decade projects are that we are working on, the boston.gov/climate resilience page has a project tracker that can give you the little overview of where some of these near-term projects are in their phasing. And for those that might be more in a design stage, we're still actively working with those projects as part of our U.S. Army Corps partnership to ensure that we are designing projects efficiently for working alongside the U.S. Army Corps CSRM system. So the third bucket is beyond 2030. How are we transforming our entire 47-mile coastline for conditions that will arise throughout this century? And so we're looking at those midterm flood pathways 2050 and those long-term flood pathways 2070 that were identified during the Climate Ready Boston and neighborhood resilience plans. And so our U.S. Army Corps partnership fits nicely into this looking ahead bucket because, as a reminder, a lot of the projects and areas that we're going to be talking about tonight as part of the study area, these are projects that are not going to be constructed tomorrow. We do have a little bit of time before we will be putting shovels in the ground for these projects because we are doing the planning over a longer life cycle for this work. So to get to our U.S. Army Corps project webpage, head to boston.gov/USACE-study. And on this webpage, you can find out about the timeline, book office hours, you can schedule that virtual meeting. You can also fill out the feedback form and watch recordings of past events. So this is where, under the heading Events and under the subheading Past Events, this is where tonight's recording and slides will be uploaded. So you can check that out. And with that, I'm going to tinker with some layout settings, but I am going to pass it over to Todd. I'm going to spotlight you for everyone. Take it away, Todd.
Awesome. Thanks, Kate. Can you hear me fine? Excellent. Awesome. Yeah, so thanks everyone. We really do appreciate you taking some time tonight to listen to our discussion. So what I wanted to do kind of up front before we kind of get into a lot of the details on the project is kind of just give you almost a why are we here. Next slide, Kate. So we're really here in this series of meetings to talk about the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. NEPA is a federal law that requires that when a major federal action requires a decision, so in this case, basically whether and how to construct flood protection for the city of Boston. That the government lay out the decision tree or the process behind making a decision, and the National Environmental Policy Act essentially says that when the government makes a decision on a major federal action, it needs to consider what we call the human environment. And so the human environment includes things such as environmental resources, fish and wildlife, animals, critters, and also physical habitat, air quality, water quality, cultural resources, socioeconomic resources, anything that human beings kind of interact with is considered the human environment. So NEPA, the law NEPA requires the government to go through a process to demonstrate to the public the thoughts and the conclusions that were made when a decision is made. So it's basically a full disclosure law. We will step through in just a slide or two what the process is, and you can see there are points along that kind of timeline or process line of where the public can put their thoughts forward and comments related to how the decision is being made. And so we're kind of at one of these points right now. We're in the beginning, or what we would call scoping phase. Now, I will say that this project is very, very far along in terms of data gathering because of all the great work that the city of Boston has done prior to the Corps being involved. But we still do need to go through our process. So while these projects have been having meetings for a period of time, we're the federal government is in the process now. So this is one of the things that we're required to do by national law. Next slide. We got a little bit of lag, I guess. We will basically create a document called a NEPA document, and I'll walk you through some different types and inform you about the path that we're on right now. But essentially, I said before that NEPA requires us to kind of lay out the logic behind the decisions that we're making and considering the environment. So the purpose of the document that we will create is to first kind of state the purpose and need and the problem. And in this case, we're talking about, coastal storm risk in the city of Boston. And then to kind of help that problem, we are developing a series of alternatives to deal with these coastal storm risk. And so the process that NEPA tells us to go through is essentially to first provide baseline conditions within your study area. So that is essentially inventory. We need to take an inventory of anything in the human environment. So again, environmental resources, cultural, socioeconomic, and those are the kind of three buckets that we're going to talk to tonight. We need to inventory those so we know what is in the project area. And then we need to do an impact analysis. And by that, I mean, we need to look at the alternatives that we are putting forward and evaluating and see how they affect those different buckets of resources. And so our NEPA document will document the purpose and need. It will document the alternatives that we are looking at. It will document our inventorying, what's in the project area. And then it will also document the impacts that we believe those different alternatives are going to have on the resources. And so that's probably that is the major reason that we're here tonight, is to provide a forum for public input on, we need to know, we would like to know what's important to you on these buckets of resources. And so later on in the presentation today, we're going to step through each of those and give you examples, so you have some thought as to what we're looking for from you, so you can consider what is important to you, submit comments to us so that we're aware. So as we formulate alternatives and we look at the impacts that these alternatives might have, there are things that we can do to avoid, minimize, or mitigate for different effects that we may having. But we need to know what's important. So while we do have a lot of data from previous studies. The state and federal agencies that we work with do have a plethora of data. We also want to know what's important to you. And then, so that's fifth bullet there, opportunities for public involvement. That's where we are now. We're in scoping. We're asking the public for any kind of comments that they might have on existing resources. So later in the presentation, we'll show a couple different ways that you can submit comments online through a QR code to the website that Kate mentioned, or you can email them directly to us. Lots of different ways for you to participate and let us know what you're thinking. And then finally, the NEPA document. We have to show, the federal government needs to show the compliance with a series of different cultural and environmental law and socioeconomic laws that provide protection to various resources. We need to show how our project is compliant with those. So within the body of the NEPA document or the report that we produce, you'll have the demonstrated compliance. Next slide, please. So our NEPA process, essentially when you're making a decision, you need to see if NEPA applies. There are some strange situations where it doesn't. Most of those are congressional authorizations that exempt you from NEPA, but we're not in this project. It's a fairly complex project, right? 47 miles of shoreline. NEPA definitely applies. There's a couple paths you can take on the extreme left of that flow chart. You can apply a categorical exclusion. That's the box with the CE in it. A categorical exclusion is an activity where it's very simple. We have a list of these categorical exclusions that are published. They're usually undertakings that don't have significant impacts, like paving a road, mowing a field, some land use where there's no impacts. So categorical exclusions are things that basically have no significant impact, and everyone's agreed to it, and it happens. So this project obviously is not a categorical exclusion. So the two other NEPA paths we have are in the center there, kind of the TAN pathway, the environmental assessment, or the EA. And then on the right, you have the kind of bluish purple pathway, the environmental impact statement. And so what we're trying to get at is the project, is the alternatives that we're considering for this project going to have a significant impact? Now, we generally measure significance in terms of kind of context and intensity, how much, how long, things of that nature, to get to significant. But the inventorying that we do, remember that was one of those steps that I talked about previously, and then the alternatives analysis and impact analysis that we do for the EA process and the EIS process are very similar. What usually the big difference is in the EIS process, you come to the conclusion that you are going to have a significant impact. And on the back end of the process, there's a little more touch points for public involvement, making sure that the public is aware that there's going to be a significant impact. For the Boston CSRM study, we are currently in that kind of TAN pathway, the EA environmental assessment. We will talk a little bit about some of the resources we're seeing and the impacts that we're seeing. But at the moment, we're in the EA, and we're going to do a programmatic. And Jeff does a really good job in just a couple more slides to talk about why we're doing a programmatic. That is essentially because of the breadth of the project, the magnitude of it. The funding mechanisms are not going to allow the project to be funded all at once. It's going to have to be broken up into kind of bite-sized segments, as he calls it, so that they can be funded and he can talk a little bit about the risk and that we're trying to avoid from doing it that way. But just so you know, at the moment, we're on the EA pathway. If we were to somehow come to the conclusion that we'll see a significant impact, we can loop back through the EIS process. Next slide. So finally, this is where we are kind of in that process that I walked through. We're at, in the beginning here, the scoping meetings. And again, we're looking for information from the public on any potential resources that may be of concern to you. We are going to do a draft document. We're hoping to get that out this summer in July. You'll be able to review that draft document. Then we'll have another series of these meetings where we kind of present the alternatives analysis that we've done, the plan that we've kind of put together, and there'll be another opportunity for input on that. But tonight, we're looking for input on the resources that may be of interest to you. Next slide. And so how can I provide comments? Kate put the link in the chat. I saw that. There's a QR code on this slide. Also in the center there is my address. You can send written comments to me. This presentation will be posted, so you'll have it. We're asking for these kind of comments on the resources to be submitted to us by the end of April. So we're continuing to work through our impact analysis. We're going to need to know those up front. Like I said, we have a lot of information, but we really want to know what's important to you. Over on the left, there's just some examples of possible things that people could be concerned about. Biological resources, water, air, socioeconomic things, land use, historical, cultural. Those are just kind of examples in case you were wondering what we're looking for. Next slide. And again, there's the QR code, the links in the chat. So now I'm going to turn it over to Jeff, and he's going to talk, next slide, Kate, a little bit about some of the measures that we're looking at. And then Ryan and I will come back and talk to you a little bit more about those resources. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Todd. Can I just get one more sound check just to make sure nothing happened over the last? Perfect, thanks.
Gotcha.
Hey, good evening again, everybody. Appreciate you attending. So over the next few minutes, we're going to have a quick math lesson, a vocabulary lesson, as well as a short discussion on staircases. And that's my way of lightly introducing this next portion, where we're going to talk about why we're doing what we're doing and the information that we've received so far. So if we go to the next slide. I realize that Kate Rosa has shared this with many of you many times, and I love it because I think it's very accurate, because it's a reminder of where we started. We started a decade ago, over a decade ago, with the Climate Ready Boston initiative from the city of Boston. And that progressed significantly between 2015 and 2022 with Plan Charlestown, Plan East Boston Phase 1, Phase 2, downtown, South Boston. So, hats off to them. In 2022, Congress said, you know what, we're going to take Climate Ready Boston and we're going to move it to the next level. And so we were authorized a new feasibility investigation, and partnership started in 2022, in which we were told to start with Climate Ready Boston and advance it to identify what federal interest lied in implementing some of the plans for coastal storm risk management. We'll talk a little bit about that again in a minute. But where we're at right now is we are developing that conceptual plan. We've got some ideas. We've got some lines on a map. Why are they just lines on a map still? You ask, and it's a very good question. It's a fair question. But the minute I put a rendering out or a picture out, and I'm not confident in that picture, and I can tell you this is what it could look like, that image is burned into your mind. And so if it changes, we have issues, and there's a communication barrier and a challenge. So at this point, I want your feedback on the lines on a map and the impacts of the lines on a map. And we've been having these conversations back and forth. And so this is just the next evolution of that. So in July of 2026, here in just a few months, we're going to release a draft NEPA document / feasibility draft. And in that, we're going to put a lot of economic and engineering information to support the lines on the map, as well as you'll see some initial renderings at that point as to what we're looking at and potential concepts as to how these features could be integrated into the community and the fabric of the community into the future. So then we're going to want some more comments and participation from the community in order to identify really, okay, this is the federal investment moving forward to preliminary design. And Todd kind of alluded to a programmatic NEPA document. And this is probably the first time that you've heard that coming from this audience in this group. And here's why. The reality is now that we've identified the alignments and the interventions that we're taking, and we'll talk about those in a minute, but now that we've identified that, we've also identified the fact that this is not going to be a very cheap undertaking. It's going to be very expensive, not only for the federal government to invest, but also for the non-federal partner to invest. And so we've identified the need to break these down into feasible, incrementable, budgetable pieces that manage the risk in the community while still giving us time to move along and further along some of these more complex elements of the system. So our most important thing is that we do not increase, induce, or transfer risk by implementing some of these first initial elements. And so I do want to make sure that that is clear, that we're not just going to build something because we can. We want to build something because it meets a need, while at the same time it does not increase, induce, or transfer that risk to the community. So we're looking at by 2028 to have that first recommendation to Congress for implementation, while we continue to move the other pieces forward over the next few years. So it'll move through all the way up through construction and operation. So it's a spiral staircase, and we're still on that spiral staircase, and we're still climbing. Next slide. Should be just a reminder slide, but if you're first time joining us, it's really important to understand that coastal storm risk, if the problem is coastal storm risk, we have to understand what are the stressors or the drivers of that coastal storm risk. The drivers that we're talking about in this scenario are wave action and erosion, and we're talking about storm surge. The stressor is sea level change. All right, so understanding that we're talking about wave action and erosion and storm surge as the drivers of the risk, we have to understand that the risk facing Boston Harbor is not necessarily the wave action and erosion. You could argue that in certain spots, either in the urban marsh environment or along the couple of beaches that are present, that you have some erosion concerns. But for the most part, because the city is built up and the infrastructure is built right up to the edge, your primary concern and the primary hazard is storm surge, that wall of water approaching the coast, and a lot of wave setup time associated with the winds and the nor'easters and the extratropical events. The stressor of that driver is sea level change, meaning that more frequent inundation is going to likely happen in the future as a result of storm surge and sea level change. The flood pathways is just kind of our way of communicating where is the water coming from in order for us to decide how we want to intervene. Next slide. Excuse me. So if this is the stress and the hazard, what are we going to do? How are we going to tackle that? And I hope that this isn't the first time that you've heard this, but we've got a few drawers in our toolbox. The first drawer, and this is your math lesson, is structural. What does structural mean? Well, risk equals the probability times the consequence of a hazard that occurs. So in and of itself, the water is not a risk. The water the water itself is not the risk. It's the coastal storm risk, i.e. the probability of the water inundating the community and what is the consequence of the water after it inundates the community. So if we want to reduce the risk, we have to either reduce the consequence or we have to reduce the the probability. In this first drawer, we seek to reduce the probability of inundation. We can do that by putting a wall up, putting a levee up, doing something to stop the water from coming across the shoreline. So that's reducing the probability. Doesn't change the consequence because it's still there if it were to cross over. The second drawer, non-structural but still physical, is important to understand. We are still building something. However, we're not building something to reduce the probability of the water coming across the shoreline. We understand the water's coming across the shoreline, so we have to reduce the consequence instead of the probability. And so that's where building adaptations come in. Some examples of building adaptation: Commonwealth Pier in South Boston, in Charlestown, Spalding Rehabilitation Hospital. Another example, Harbor Towers, excuse me, our friends over in the Wharf District, I've seen it every day. But Harbor Towers is another great example of an investment in building adaptations. The third drawer, the Corps of Engineers does not necessarily get into the weeds on, but we can make these recommendations, and a lot of the times they're good recommendations. These are those non-structural, non-physical. These are your zoning rules. These are your permitting, planning rules that would bring people out of the floodplain or reduce the consequence of that hazard from occurring, thereby reducing your overall risk. Next slide. So let's just focus on that first drawer, that structural drawer. All right. And if we're looking, here's some newer icons, but they're the same tools that we've been talking about all along. All right. And this is a typical flood wall. Now, if it's a flood wall that's not a water side, we're not talking about building in the water. This is out of the water. But if we build a flood wall and we bury it, or we put a harbor walk on the other side of it, it's still a flood wall. All right. And so when we say a vertical flood wall, a typical flood wall, that means it usually has a deep tile foundation to prevent seepage, but also to maintain structural integrity so it doesn't turn over. If you've ever seen someone's yard and it has a beautiful yard on one side, it's slightly elevated, but the wall itself is slightly canted forward, that's because of the foundation wasn't set up properly, and so it started to roll forward. We don't want that with a typical flood wall, and so we have to make sure that our foundation is deep. These are great if you have real estate constraints, or if you want to be able to adapt it to look like something else. A waterside flood wall, similar. It's intended to reduce the probability. It has a smaller real estate footprint, just like a typical flood wall. However, this is something that's going to be built into the water. Why would we build it into the water? A, real estate constraints. B, we don't have confidence in the existing seawall, structural integrity. We might not be familiar with the amount of utilities that are in the ground where the natural ground already is, or we might not understand what kind of fill is already there. And so to avoid any potential hazardous, toxic, radioactive waste type materials, we might want to go on the water side. So there are some areas where we're looking at a waterside solution. A berm. A berm could be a 2-to-1 rise type. It could be 3-to-1. The goal of a berm is where you have more real estate and you can go with a shallow foundation. Go with a berm, because then you can still have the same structural protection at the top from the water without the intrusiveness of all the subsurface impacts. Floodgates are necessary where you might have a wall or a berm, but you have a driveway or you have a road crossing. So you need to have some sort of closure structure. It might be stop logs, it might be a roller gate, it might be a sliding gate, or a swing gate. Raised intersection. There are certain areas where we are looking at raised roads in order to protect the area behind the road. A couple of examples: Tomahawk Drive over by the airport, by Perteel Park. If we elevate one small area, it connects and closes two flood pathway high ground points. And by doing so, it protects the area behind Tomahawk Drive. Another example could be Morrissey Boulevard by Bianculli. If you're familiar with UMass Boston and South Boston, if we slightly change the grade of Morrissey at that intersection of Bianculli and Morrissey, then we could cut that flood pathway off and tie it into another flood protection project over by Patton's Cove and Seven Hill. So it's just an example of where we're not raising the road in order to take the work away from DOT. What we're raising the road for is to protect the area behind. Next slide. All right, next slide. I'm going to be back in just a few minutes to talk about some socioeconomic information, but now what I wanted to do is introduce Ryan Constantine and have him talk to you a little bit about the archaeology and the historical significance that you are already well aware of, but we have to document, and we need your help documenting it. So Ryan, I'll turn it over to you and let you take over.
Thanks, Jeff. So as you all know, Boston has a depth of history and occupation within our study area. And one of the areas that we wanted to start with was really how NEPA and something called Section 106 work together. And one of the easy ways to think about it is that NEPA is the framework that looks at the whole environment. And Section 106 would be the part that focuses specifically on cultural and historic resources. So Section 106 is not a separate process from NEPA. It is one of the key compliance areas evaluated within that NEPA process. And Todd will speak to that a little bit later. But agencies typically conduct the Section 106 process during NEPA so that cultural resources and their impacts are considered before decisions are made. Next slide. So what is Section 106? It is a portion of the National Historic Preservation Act. And this is an act that requires federal agencies to take into account the effects of their undertakings on historic properties that are listed or eligible for inclusion on something called the National Register of Historic Places. And since the Corps is the lead federal agency for the Boston CSRM project, this is a federal undertaking. So a federal undertaking then would be a project, an activity, or a program that is funded either partially or in whole by a federal agency. And to sum that up then, NEPA would provide the decision-making framework, and Section 106 supplies the historic and resource analysis that feeds into that framework. Next slide. So if we're looking at protecting and preserving Boston's very rich history and heritage, what kinds of legal frameworks are we working under? Next slide. So outside of Section 106 of the National Historic Preservation Act, there are two other sort of key laws that are really helping shape this investigation and analysis. And those would be the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, or NAGPRA, and then the Archaeological Resource Protection Act, or ARPA. Next slide. There are also a whole other sort of realm of laws that also affect what we're investigating and how we're analyzing it. And I have them up on the screen, and they range between the Abandoned Shipwreck Act, the Historic Sites Act, all the way down to the World Heritage Conservation Act. Next slide. So when we're talking compliance with these legal frameworks, what we're really talking about most of the time would be historic properties. And that's a capital sort of historic properties. And that would be any prehistoric or historic district, archaeological site, building, structure. And in Boston, structures usually cover things like seawalls, bridges, things that are not necessarily a house or a business. And again, they don't necessarily have to be listed on the National Register of Historic Places. They just have to be eligible for it. This also includes any kinds of items, artifacts, records, and remains that might be associated with those actual sort of districts, sites, buildings, stuff like that. Next slide. We also wanted to give you some examples. So when we're talking about historic properties that could be prehistoric archaeological sites, people in Boston have wanted to live in the same places for hundreds, if not thousands of years. So even though there is a lot of urban development, as you can see on the screen, we have prehistoric, pre-contact Native American archaeological sites that are still present here in urban Boston. And so this is one of the things that we are looking for and trying to determine, are they present in the study area? What is the sensitivity for them? Things like that. Next slide. When we talk about historic sort of archaeological sites and structures, I wanted to throw up some examples. We can have historic ships that have been rehabbed and are still in use today. We have historic buildings. We have those historic districts. And then again, just because there has been a lot of modern development, those historic archaeological sites are still present here within the study area. Next. When we're talking about sort of submerged historic properties or submerged cultural resources, we're not just talking about shipwrecks. A lot of the times that could be what we're talking about, but we could be talking about submerged archaeological sites. A lot of areas in Boston have had intensive infill. And so areas that have been submerged, where you could have a shipwreck, you could have a site that was submerged, it is now part of the landform. So sometimes shipwrecks could show up in downtown Boston. Next. We also wanted to talk to you a little bit about some of the investigation that has occurred and some of it that is currently ongoing. So we've completed a historical review of the study area and what is essentially a preliminary assessment of the potential for direct and indirect. When we say direct impacts, what we're referring to most of the time would be what is in the construction footprint, what might be impacted from building part of the project. When we're talking about those indirect impacts, we'd be talking about what kind of visual changes are going to occur once that measure is built. This historic context would cover the entire study area. And those assessments of impacts are more limited because it is a baseline study. We're still sort of looking at those conceptual lines on a map. So what the ongoing analysis is doing is really evaluating adverse effects and that would be anticipated for those historic properties and cultural resources. And we think that there is a potential to adversely affect things as we move forward. So we're going to continue to evaluate the impact of the installation of above ground measures. Next. So one of the key parts of our investigation and assessment is our interaction with consulting parties. And who are consulting parties? This ranges from landmark districts, the State Historic Preservation Officer, the Massachusetts Historic Commission, down to universities, tribal partners, even, interested community groups and community members. So everyone that participates in these meetings would be considered a consulting party. Next. So when we're talking about impacts to those historic properties that we went over earlier, if you want to sort of separate them into three buckets, it's an easy way to sort of understand what we're investigating. So when we're talking about the archaeological resources, we're looking at what kind of ground disturbance. Has there been any disturbance to an area that has not been previously excavated? And that would include new excavation that we might be doing that would go deeper or wider than previous excavations on the same site. What kinds of above ground construction, including construction of temporary roads and access facilities, grading or landscaping, might we be looking at as part of the project? Are we doing really any kind of modification to the topography? When we're talking about those architectural resources like historic districts, historic buildings, we're concerned about the direct physical damage from new construction and demolition activities. Are we going to have any vibration and movement from construction? That would be something like pile driving, foundation work, even increased truck traffic. What kind of construction debris might happen during the project? Is there a construction site runoff? What kind of alteration of a resource's integrity of setting? Are we changing how someone might experience a historic building? And then, usually most important to folks would be sort of those indirect visual impacts from construction of project features. Lastly, when we're talking about those submerged cultural resources, does the project have any dredging? Are we doing onshore and underwater construction? Is there excavation for deep foundations, for driving piles? Are there any temporary barriers erected for construction? That would be like caissons, cofferdams, things like that. And then sort of lastly, what kind of onshore ground disturbance? Is there disturbance to an area that hasn't been previously excavated? And then due to the creation of land through those historic filling activities, again, large areas of formerly open water are now built up urban land. Next slide. So when we're trying to resolve some of those potential adverse effects to historic properties, again, we sort of separated out into three categories. The first one being the development of a programmatic agreement. And you can think of a programmatic agreement as something that is like a contract between the federal government and other parties. And its intent is to manage the effects on historic properties. And for projects as big and as wide in scope as this project, we can't always determine the effects before approval. So this allows us to move forward with an understanding that there are things that we're going to have to do moving forward. Those things move us into the second bucket. For future investigations, we use something quite often that's called a mitigation hierarchy. And that starts with avoidance. And that's really the highest priority. So that means we would potentially change the project so that a historic property is not affected at all. And this is really the preferred outcome for Section 106 because it preserves the property in place and eliminates the adverse effect. This quite often would be something like shifting project alignment, establishing protective buffers, things like that. Now, if we can't avoid those effects, we move into the second priority, which would be minimization. And if impacts cannot be completely avoided, we're going to really try to reduce the severity or the extent of the impact. And that could be reducing the footprint of ground disturbance, using construction techniques that limit vibration, things like that. And then lastly, sort of the last resort would be mitigation. And that's really required when adverse effects remain after avoidance and minimization have been considered. And it doesn't prevent the damage. Instead, it compensates for the loss of historic value. So that could be something like an archaeological data recovery, so a big excavation. It could be a historic American building survey. It could be preservation easements, things like that. And then lastly, one of the key components, like we talked about with the consulting parties, is this consultation process. It's iterative. It's something that we're doing, and it's something we're going to continue to do. So input from stakeholders like you guys is really important. It allows us to understand what's in your neighborhood, what's important to you, what's important to your neighbors. And it allows us to develop what we like to think of as sympathetic designs. Something that if we build it in your neighborhood, it's not going to look out of place. It's not going to look like it doesn't belong. And again, this will be part of our routine coordination and consultation moving forward. Next slide. This is the last slide, I promise. So as we move from that feasibility into design phase, which is really looking at that beyond 2028, we're looking at doing sort of these more targeted neighborhood assessments. So as we get a better understanding of what the design and what our measures could look like, these are some of the things that we're still considering. So would the project, conflict with structural barriers in buildings that already exist? An example would be stone walls that are both historic or part of the harbor walk design. Are there conflicts with historic buildings within that direct footprint? What kind of view shed changes are occurring? Are there any kind of conflicts with intangibles, such as, recent parks? What kinds of, built landscapes exist? The Harbor Walk installations? Things that are a little bit more modern, but still important to your community. And then lastly, again, once we have a better idea of the designs and impacts, what kinds of, conflicts are happening with our archaeological resources? Next slide. So that sort of wraps up our discussion about historic preservation and historic properties. So I'm going to pass you over to Todd, and he's going to talk a little bit more about our environmental resources.
Thanks, Ryan. And again, just to reiterate, the reason that we're here is we're looking for information, right? Because our NEPA process tells us that we need to reach out to the public and ask them. So on the cultural side, on these environmental resources that I'm going to talk about, or some of the socioeconomic stuff that Jeff will talk about after I'm done the final portion of the talk. We're looking for your input to see if there's anything within these areas that are of concern to you. Next slide, Kate. So just really quickly, I wanted to kind of throw out some of the environmental resource, what they are, what we've been looking at, where we are to date with some of our analysis. Like I said, this study is much further along than most core studies are at this point. Usually we're starting at ground zero, but as Jeff laid out and Kate pointed out earlier in the presentation, the city of Boston has really advanced the commitment to flood protection over the last decade. So we do have a lot of information, but again, this is a check-in to make sure with on the public side, if there's anything we haven't heard about, we really, really want to know about it as we continue to formulate our alternatives. So environmental resources are what most people think of when someone says environmental resources, right? The bugs and bunnies, whales and snails, whatever you want to call them, the critters, such as fish and wildlife, threatened and endangered species, the plants, right? Upland vegetation, wetland vegetation, as well as the whole habitat, physical environment. So water quality, air quality, sediments and soil, noise, the floodplains, coastal hydraulics. All of these are examples of environmental resources. And again, I think I stated it before, we have great partners at the city, the state, and the federal level that keep tabs on a lot of these. But if there are any specific resources that you are concerned about, we definitely want to hear them. And kind of that's the purpose, is to solicit comments from you on those. Next slide. So what I kind of wanted to do, so we talked about this when I talked about NEPA, and Ryan showed the Cultural Resource Acts. There are a lot of environmental laws and regulations that this project will have to comply with. They'll be documented in our NEPA document. And again, they like I said, cover environmental resources, the species, right? Fish and Wildlife Coordination Act, Endangered Species Act, the physical environment, air quality, water quality. So within our NEPA document, you'll see laid out that we comply or how we comply on the decisions we're making with all these laws. Next slide. I wanted to throw this out here. This has been a good one to come back to at the end when we talk about questions. But if you have been following the study, the Army Corps portion of it, you know that we've divided the city kind of up into five different neighborhoods, and we're looking at measures in each one of those five different neighborhoods. So I'm going to step through a couple slides that show some of these environmental resources in the neighborhoods, kind of what we've been doing for inventorying, a bunch of the data that we've been working with. And then I kind of highlighted some of the spots where we see some of the impacts from some of the proposed actions. So you get a feel for the impact analysis that we're doing. And like I said, frame your concern and anything that you want to let us know about. So the next couple slides will be kind of by neighborhood. So I just wanted to reiterate that that's how we kind of have the study area broken up. Next slide, Kate. Remember I said NEPA for environmental, the human environment. We're looking at cultural, we're looking at environmental, we're looking at socioeconomic, and our kind of steps are inventorying, trying to figure out what's there. So to that end, we've done a lot. We've utilized a lot of the existing, like I said, state, city, and federal databases on these kind of resources. We've also done our own. We've done a lot of habitat characterization. On the right, you can see we did a side scan sonar, which is basically it allows us to get a picture through the water of what the bottom habitat's like. That picture on the right is of the Little Mystic Channel. And you can see some of the things that we found in there. There was a barge, a sunken power boat, some rubble mounds. So for our inventory, we've been doing some work to define the habitat that we see in some of the areas that we may impact. We also have associated kind of photo documentation of the seawalls and the habitat that's on those seawalls within the whole perimeter of the entire study area. So we have that. We do have some actual biological information over on the left. You can see some video of a mussel bed over in South Boston. So those are the kind of things, the data sets that we're collecting and we're working with. And then, where we do have measures that may cross or on land, if they're up against a marsh or running through a park or a field. We've done upland vegetation surveys and some documentation of how close to the marsh edges we may need to get with some of these. So just to give you an example of the inventories that we've done and the kind of data that we're looking for, and or concerns that you may have towards these particular environmental resources. This is kind of where we are. We want to know kind of what you're concerned about. Next slide, Kate. So as we kind of slip into what are the environmental impacts, I kind of highlighted some of these. Again, we're still in alternative kind of alignment formulation, so we don't have hard and fast numbers on these. But just to give you an example of where we're seeing some impacts and how we think they're going, the biggest one that we're seeing probably is habitat alteration. And so that would be a permanent change. And most of that occurs in areas where we have those kind of seawalls that Jeff was talking about, a wall in front of a wall. So you're basically you're coming out 3-4 feet in front of an existing seawall to put another seawall. You're going to have to drive pilings. There might be a little bit of fill. I think I have a graphic coming up that shows you that and kind of puts out some really, really preliminary numbers on what we're seeing. But that kind of habitat conversion is one kind of impact. There are other examples where we could create berms or levees, and you wouldn't necessarily, you would raise the elevation of that area, but you wouldn't actually change the habitat. It could still be, shrubs or, like a park, grassland, ball fields, things of that nature. So we do have those kind of habitat alteration impacts. There are a lot of temporary impacts that Ryan talked a lot about, impacts from construction, elevated noise, increase in turbidity in the waters if you're putting in a piling. But we do have a lot of construction practices, things called best management practices that we can employ to avoid these impacts or minimize them. You can, for the noise, if you're driving pilings, you can put in a restriction so they don't do it at night, so they're not, so it's not as intrusive as pile driving 24 hours a day. With turbidity, you can work with silt curtains. So there are things you can do to minimize impacts, and across all the environmental resources, we are trying to do that, and we will kind of lay those out in the document. And then, as Ryan noted, with the cultural resources, We also consult with environmental resource agencies. We discuss the impacts on those critters or those resources, and we can kind of come up with ways to avoid, minimize, and impacts to environmental resources too. Next slide, Kate. Like I said, I wanted to show a couple slides just to kind of give you an idea of how we can avoid, minimize, and impact. So this is a slide of endangered species. We collectively threatened and endangered species we call protected species. There are several throughout the project area. And as you can see, plovers and terns do occur within a bunch of the neighborhoods. So we can work, even though they're there, we can work with those kind of avoidance and minimization practices, like only working or constructing during a certain time period to avoid significant impacts to critters like that. The aquatic species, again, they're in the water. We don't have a whole host of those are kind of fringe. They either migrate through or they're really transient. But again, we do have practices that we can do if we're putting pilings in the water, for example, to minimize the noise and pressure that's created by pile driving. So there are definitely actions that we can take to lower the risk of a significant impact to different resources. Next slide. I throw the next slide up. Oh, there it is. So this is just on the left is some maps of the shellfish in the harbor. And again, we can avoid impacts to some by timing of our construction. On the right, we have a list of some of the common important recreational and commercial fish species in the harbor. And so again, working with the state, city, and federal agencies, we have a wealth of information on when they're there. So, and then specifically sometimes that we might want to avoid construction periods. As you can see, the fall and the spring runs for some of the anadromous fish. So these are just some of the data sets that we're working with. But again, the point of this meeting is to not to really explain everything and talk about impacts. We'll do that once the draft comes out. But right now, we want to know if there's anything out there that is of concern to you, so that we can include that in our kind of plan formulation and alternatives analysis. Next slide, Kate. This is again, I was talking about those habitat alteration. Again, this is probably the biggest kind of impact that we're seeing as we kind of look for significant impacts. But again, we have many tools. Like Ryan said, if we can't avoid and we can't minimize, then we may have to mitigate. And so some areas where we may need some mitigation within this project. If you take a look at the little graphic there of the flood side wall, the little cartoon with the stick figure on top, the gray blocks would be an existing seawall, and the yellow area at the bottom would be the existing subtidal bottom. As Jeff said, you would have to essentially drive some pilings in front of that to put a supported wall, an engineered wall in front of that. And then you may need to kind of fill. So that would be the little orange shaded area in there. To basically get the engineering right for the wall. So that entire impact, the filling and then the placement of pilings is going to displace, or as I said before, kind of permanently alter some habitat. So again, if you look at those numbers over on the left, those are really, really preliminary. But remember, we're talking about 47 miles of coastline, and some of our alignments do, even though you are going 3 to 4 feet out, it doesn't seem like that much at one point one, kind of small area in time. But when you look at the entire perimeter of the coast and some of the solutions that are possible in the mix as alternatives, it does kind of add up into a significant number of bottom alteration. Next slide. So again, just the listing of what's out there for environmental resources, anything we missed, anything that you know about that you want us to know, shoot us a comment, and we'd be definitely glad to try and incorporate that concern into our planning. So next slide, Jeff's going to talk to us about some socioeconomic resources. Then we'll give you a timeline, and then we'll have some time for questions. Jeff.
Hey, thanks. And so everyone's been so patient. I realized we were about 70 minutes into the presentation, and really this is a lot of us giving you information to give you something that you can give us feedback on. So I do recognize that, and we're going to try and save a few minutes at the end for questions and comments, but really this is an opportunity to just give you an update so that you can then come back and provide us additional information through the comment period. So let's talk about socioeconomic resources. And I'm going to give you economic data in order to tell a socioeconomic story. What I mean by that, if we go to the next slide, we are going to, I'm going to give you some economic information that goes around housing, health and safety, income and employment, population demographics, and infrastructure and transportation, which takes existing publicly available information that we use to create social vulnerability assessments for each of the 5 neighborhoods. So that is the ACS 5-year data, as well as the census data from the census tracts. We input that into our Generation 2 coastal risk model, as well as we built in our model areas, and we then built in a storm suite of hundreds of both synthetic as well as historical storms that range anywhere from an everyday storm with a astronomical high tide at high tide with sea level change to a Cat 5 hurricane type, a Sandy type event, as well as the 3 nor'easters that most recently occurred, including Riley and Grayson in 2018. So we feed this into the model, as well as we put in the city's evacuation planning, emergency action planning, and then we build that into the 20,000 or so assets, those buildings in the study area, in order to identify what are those impacts. Now, we don't just run the model one time and say, this is it, this is the result. This is a life cycle model that takes into consideration FEMA requirements to elevate and evacuation planning and such in order to identify. So it runs a Monte Carlo simulation. So over a 50-year period of analysis, every day a storm may or may not happen of this magnitude, may or may not happen. And it spits out a number at the end of value. So then we run that 100 more times. So we get 100 iterations of a 50-year life cycle in which storms would likely occur at different intervals and different consequences. And that's the numbers that you're going to see here in just a minute. So let's use economic numbers to tell a socioeconomic story. Next slide. So when you look at owner-occupied versus renter-occupied, the most owner-occupied community right now happens to be Charlestown. It's 49.21%. That's still less than 50% is owner-occupied. That means when a storm hits, not only is the property owner or the homeowner impacted, but the renter is impacted. That's more than just a monetary impact. That is a social impact on 2 families, not just one. So you have owner-occupied and you have renter-occupied. And you see how high in downtown, 76% is renter occupied. That's a significant number. And of that, you have over 80% of the people, with the exception of downtown, but over 80% of the people have a mortgage. Surprise, I have a mortgage. You probably have a mortgage. And so that means that not only are you impacted from an economic standpoint because your home is inundated and you're recovering from it, you still have to pay for repairs on top of your mortgage. So that's a social impact beyond just the monetary damages that we count and do account for. When you consider all of the potential damages, all right, this is not trying to be hyperbolic. Some of you might actually think this is a little bit low, but the impact to residential structures or homes or condos, apartments, $2.1 billion over the 50-year period of analysis in 2026 dollars. And so this is not annualized. This is not benefit to cost ratio. This is not how much it's going to cost. That's potential for $2.1 billion to the residential structures and communities here in Boston. Next slide. Life safety and health and safety. I'm not talking about life loss here. What I'm referring to is that based off of our different floodplains, 500 all the way down to the 100-year floodplain, you have a potential of 85,000 people in your risk area. The city has a great evacuation plan. The city has great evacuation routes. The city has identified evacuation shelters, community shelters. This is a tool that helps to identify, do we need to make changes if we're not going to do any kind of intervention? So this is a great tool for the city to then take. And you'll notice here that between that 10 and 12 foot NAVD 88 elevation, we're not using BCB, Boston City Basic, we're using NAVD 88, that 10 to 12 foot range. That's a very high exposed value. But then when you look between that 13 and 14 NAVD 88 foot value, that's 27,000 people who are in that population at risk. So it helps to identify what are those minimum target elevations if we're going to do structural interventions. Where do we have to, at least at a minimum, target in order to maximize that return on investment from a socioeconomic perspective? Next slide. Employment, most of you are probably not surprised, but agriculture, forestry, fishing, and farming is not a significant piece of the employment story here in Boston. But you know what is? Those professional services, educational services, medical services, healthcare services, STEM type services. All right. And so when you consider where your employment characteristics are coming from, that impacts people's ability to get to work. So if you do have educational services, healthcare services, and these professional type services, all right, if they can't get to work, how are they paying their rent? How are they paying their mortgage? How are they buying their groceries? So if they can't get to work, it's a lot more of a social impact than just, oh, I'm in my house and I can't go to work because the roads are flooded. I guess I'm going to get a paid day off. I put on these income characteristics, median incomes and everything, because it's an important story. If these were Nebraska or Kansas, somewhere in the Midwest or somewhere in the Deep South, this is upper class. This is the upper class. This is probably in the top 1%, right? But the reality is for Massachusetts in this area, this region, this is middle class at best, and for some areas it might be lower middle class. So it's an important story for us to factor and consider that just because you see a dollar value associated with an income, it does not necessarily portray the true economic characteristics. Next slide. Population. Why is population important? Because if you are going to do an intervention in an area or not do an intervention in an area, what is the population demographic that you're impacting? From an age perspective, if they're elderly, it may require additional medical attention or support to evacuate. It may take additional time. And so it's important for us to understand what is the population makeup from an age perspective, because again, if somebody is of an older population, can they really leave for 3 to 5 days? Can they really be trapped in their home for 3 to 5 days if we choose not to do a structural intervention and do a building adaptation? What happens when that storm lasts 3 to 5 days? Are we asking them to stay put for 3 to 5 days? How realistic is that actually? So this is the story that we can use these economic economic figures to help tell that socioeconomic story. Next slide. I saved this one for last intentionally because a lot of what I showed previously is directly impacted by this. All right, transportation infrastructure, $37 billion in potential future damages if we do nothing. What that means is all those people, the 54% of East Boston that commutes via public transportation. Charlestown is 40%, but you know what? If it's 40%, that's because they're probably driving. And if they're driving, they need to be able to access the roads, bridges, tunnels in order to get to work, in order to make a paycheck, in order to pay their mortgage, in order to buy their groceries, in order to do the repairs. So transportation and infrastructure is a very real socioeconomic challenge that this project hopes to address. Utilities and equipment, $2.3 billion. Public and community buildings, $112 million. Educational buildings, $655 million. All right, this is not hyperbole. This is not saying this is what will happen. This is what's saying, based off of probability models, run 100 iterations, this is the potential damages in the future. And this is why there is certainly federal interest in this project. So overall, there is a potential over the next 50 years with no federal investment of $57 billion in 2026 dollar value, $57 billion in damages. So there is definitely federal interest. Now it's a matter of identifying what is the appropriate intervention approach and technique in each of the individual areas, because what works in one neighborhood may not be appropriate in another one. That's where you come in. That's where you can assist us. So next slide. Let's go next slide. Over the next few months, we're gonna continue to put this information together, and we're going to publish a what we call a draft release, and that's going to trigger another comment period. So over the next 30 days, while we're working on developing our plan, your feedback can be incorporated in early. Earlier is always better. Your feedback can be incorporated in. What else did we miss? What else do we need to look at? And then we'll release the draft report and say, okay, here's our recommendation at this point in time. Give us your feedback. That feedback will come from both peer review as well as technical review, as well as resource agency review, and hopefully some public review and public comments. We'll take that and then over the next year, refine our designs and try and finalize our recommendation to Congress. All right, so next slide. Share your concerns. Help to answer these questions that you see on the screen. Provide comments, the emails, links. You saw the QR code. In fact, we can go to the next and we can click on them in the chat. But please provide comments, provide feedback, okay? We've had several of these meetings over the last couple of days. The participation has not been where I'm hoping it is, because I truly want to make this a two-way conversation. I've heard a lot from the community over the last couple of years, but that doesn't mean I've heard enough from the community. So this is that next level of communication back and forth. I realize we only have about 7 minutes, but I do welcome any comments in the chat. What we don't get to, we will capture in the official record, and that way you'll have an opportunity to see, get and receive a response. So Todd, I'll turn it over to you and Kate and see if there's any kind of questions or comments.
We got questions in the chat, so I want to toss first one to, I believe we have one from Sarah, a recommendation or a question. Are there comment email addresses? I responded in the chat, but I will post those to our website, so we'll have the email list. A question in the chat from Maria for Todd. Are there any studies concerning the estuary around the Neponset River, a state-named area of critical environmental concern? Todd,
Yeah,
go for it.
we do have a few measures down there. So we do have some side scan, and then, like I said, those associated kind of intertidal habitat photo documentation, and kind of habitat interpretation within the appendix of the report that'll come out this summer. So yeah, we basically in areas where we had proposed measures, we tried to collect as much data as we have. Yep.
Thank you, Todd. And we
Mhm.
had a question from Sarah in the chat. Is the Office of Historic Preservation and impacted individual Boston landmark districts participating in this process? So for Ryan.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thanks, Sarah. Yes, so that's the short answer. Both our Office of Historic Preservation here in the city, as well as the Massachusetts Historical Commission, are involved in the study. We're consulting with them right now. We're also working with the individual landmark districts as well as the state historic preservation officer. So as we've gone through the identification process, we've been consulting with them and we will continue moving forward.
Thank you, Ryan. Nicole, I see you have your hand raised. You can go ahead and come off mute and ask your question.
Great. Thank you so much. I really appreciate you going through a very complex process in a very respectable amount of time. So thank you. My interest is also in historic resources. So my questions are really geared towards the Section 106 part of things. So hi, Ryan. Um, and I am kind of new to this particular project and this particular process. So some of my questions might be a little behind the eight ball, but I'm wondering if there are interim Section 106 documents that we can take a look at, if there have been meeting notes from consulting parties meetings, and whether organizations can still request consulting party status.
No, that's a great one. So a little bit of both in regards to sort of the ongoing work that we're doing, right? As part of our initial sort of identification of what kinds of historic properties, what kinds of cultural resources are in the study area, we worked with a consulting firm to sort of collect that baseline study. And so that has been sort of processed and it's being finalized. That is on file with the State Historic Preservation Office. When the draft report comes out in July, the all of those findings, all of the records of consultation that we've been doing will be a part of that draft report. So that'll be available to y'all either online or on the website, and that would sort of sum up the investigation, what was identified, those preliminary effects determinations, and then again that record of consultation. All of throughout the process, if you or a community member, a community group, a historical society, anyone that is a consulting party, you can request to participate as a consulting party, especially as we put together this programmatic agreement. We have a whole status of interested parties that would be part of that. So you don't have to do it today. You can do it in the future, or if you know of folks that learn of the study as we move forward, they can always reach out to us or to me directly, and we can start sort of that consultation coordination process. And if some of the information is sort of considered sensitive when it comes to the identification of things like archaeological sites and stuff like that. So some of the information is a little more limited, but we're always able to share as much as we can.
Thank you for your question, Nicole. Maria, I see your hand is raised. You can go ahead and come off mute.
Hi, I put a question in the chat again, but I figured I'd just talk instead. So thank you, Army Corps of Engineer, for all your work and the City of Boston. I'm just concerned about, I know when the Climate Ready Boston plan was first proposed, they told us that it was mostly about the public lands that they had designs for and ideas for, and not any of the private lands, which I know in my neighborhood, Norfolk, Jeff, the most of the outline of Port Norfolk is private. development. And, changing one area can affect another. Specifically putting berms along Tenny Inn can cause it to go into Port Norfolk. So are there any plans with the Army Corps of Engineers to look at these private sites to work on projects that would go along with the climate ready Boston ideas on the public sites, so that it would be more seamless. That's a good word, right? So for this, any ideas on that?
So I want to put out a point of clarification that it's the Corps of Engineers is looking at both private and public facilities and assets in protecting those. Our primary driver for not going around Port Norfolk is because of the number of structures that are already elevated on Port Norfolk outside of the existing floodplain. And the city, I believe, they can further elaborate, but I believe the city is working on a pilot type program for some of the remaining structures and assets. And so to be able to cut off that flood pathway around Tenny, and it would require us to go up through Tenny and around Pine Neck or Neponset Creek. Different people refer to it differently, but then go all the way around Port Norfolk and then still find a place to tie in up the Neponset River. So it became a real engineering challenge for us. And with the number of structures that are already elevated out of the floodplain, we deferred to the city in their pilot program. And then we can evaluate at a later date as to whether or not some other adaptation type features would still be necessary. So it's not a matter of public versus private by any means. And I don't want that to be a misunderstanding or miscommunication between us and the specifically Port Norfolk community. Maria, we've had some great conversations, but I'd ask if the city wants to touch on that pilot program real quick. I understand we're tight on time.
Yeah, no, I know about the public. We're actually involved, and it's very good. It's about the houses in the area, so it's not dealing with the businesses around the outer edge. And I know one of the businesses in particular, Venezia, the restaurant, they were like, "What about us?" And if you don't stop it there, it's going to come into the neighborhood anyways. But anyway, that's the way it was explained to us, Jeff, in the beginning, that the city was only dealing with the public. So. Anyway, I do know about the housing because we are involved, and hopefully our house is going to be the first one that's evaluated. So, but Chris might want to talk about it. So thank you, Jeff.
It was good, Maria, great to see you. Thank you for being here tonight. And I'll follow up with you to talk about sort of the full range of tools that we're looking at. Obviously, the Army Corps is an incredibly important partner. And it is one of the strategies that we're looking at for implementation, one of the most important ones. But we'll follow up with you about some of the other things which we are also looking at. Obviously, you are quite familiar with the work focused on the residences of Port Norfolk. So I'll shoot you an email after this.
Thanks.
Well, I appreciate everyone tonight. Oh, Sarah, go ahead. You can come off mute, ask your question.
Sorry, my mouse wasn't taking me off mute. Thanks, Kate. I'll make this quick. Just a sort of more procedural question. On becoming a consulting party, do you become a consulting party to the entire process, or do you need to do for historic to Ryan and to environmental to Todd and et cetera and so forth? So if you could just explain that a little bit. Thank you.
I can sort of talk to the historic preservation, historic properties component. So when we're looking at consulting parties specifically for the Section 106 and sort of that NEPA side, outside of some of the concerns that maybe like Todd is looking at, you would be essentially part of the conversation and the coordination of our effects determination, the investigation, things like that. So it is iterative. So it would start, whenever you'd want to be involved, and it would continue pretty much throughout the process. And at any point that, if you didn't want to be a consulting party, or it was something that you didn't want to be a part of, it's easy for us to, to sort of stop that. So I think I hope I answered it.
So I just want, and Todd, I'll let you chime in. I just want to be careful about utilizing the word consulting party, which for the NEPA process is slightly different than for the Section 106 process. So understanding that you are from, Sarah, you are from the Harborfront Neighborhood Association, which is kind of the larger group for the waterfront, right? Not to be too simple. So we would invite your comments. We would invite your participation. But from a NEPA perspective, the term consulting party is very specific to some of our requirements. So we definitely want you to be a part of the process, and we definitely want to meet with you as a key stakeholder. But utilizing that term consulting party is slightly different in the NEPA world than the Section 106 world.
Yeah, I agree, Jeff. Thanks.
Thank you both. That's why I asked the question. I've been involved in different sort of situations as a consulting party and not. So thank you.
Thank you, everybody, for these wonderful questions. We do have some follow-up items from the chat, so I will be reaching out to folks, and you will see more information posted to our project website. But I will give Jeff Herzog, would you like to leave our closing word before we end for tonight? Have our last word?
I just want to thank everybody for, it's 7:30 on a Thursday, so I'm sure there's probably other places or family that you want to be spending time with. So I truly appreciate you taking the time out of tonight to spend with us. And again, this is just the next step in our communication, in our story, and our walk together through this process. It's exciting because in July we're going to release a draft report, and that draft report is going to portray a system that we are recommending to Congress for implementation over the next several years. So it's truly the next evolution of Climate Ready Boston. And I've said it before and I'll say it again, this partnership that we have with the City of Boston and the Commonwealth is unparalleled. To the 10 years I've been working with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers across the nation, including Pacific territories. It's unparalleled. So hats off to the partnership with the city and the relationship with you all as taking time out of your evening to join us. So thank you.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody.